started in on a lot of the tall fescue work I had done, and she had mentioned doing some bermudagrass, and by the time I got done with the tall fescue, there wasn't a whole lot of room for bermudagrass. But anyway, I added it in, and it's in your notebook, and I'll just talk until I run out of time. This is one of those subjects that I just really like to talk about, so we may just kind of get all over the world on this. But when we talk about tall fescue, and when it's one of those grasses that looks really good. This is one of my pastures I had in southwest Arkansas along a creek bottom. Outstanding looking grass. This was well managed, well fertilized, toxic tall fescue. When we look at the quality of tall fescue, I've got this black bar here, or black line. That's small grain, which I was raised in central Oklahoma. That's what I would equate to the best quality forage that we could produce. And when we start looking at crude protein, especially with calves that really don't need much more than 12 or 15% crude protein, and cattle gaining about 2 pounds a day, don't need anything much more than 65% TDN in these forages. It's an excellent quality forage when we start looking at the tall fescue. And whenever we look at the toxic versus the non-toxic, there's really no difference in the quality of that. The issue, whenever I start talking about toxic tall fescue, the issue is those toxins. They do give some great benefits to the plant. That endophyte that's in that plant makes it robust, makes it easy we can overgraze it, we can mismanage it, we can do a lot of things wrong, and that plant will stay in the stand. The problem comes from our livestock performance. One of the dead giveaways, this may be a little bit hard to see, but this is a calf I had in northern Arkansas. He's on a toxic tall fescue stand. He should be gaining about 2 pounds a day. Right here, he was gaining about right at a pound a day. And when we start talking about the costs of tall fescue on stocker cattle, it's not just the reduced gains, but we're starting to look at rough hair coats and other issues that just tell the buyer, this calf has tall fescue toxicosis, and they're going to decrease the bids. Along this same year, we had a field day, and I would say we were probably in what most of us would consider a thermo-neutral environment. It was, mid-spring, mid-April, and these cattle should have been out grazing, not needing shade, a lot of that. Here's the non-toxic endophyte infected tall fescue stand. We have these mirror fount waters. They're not supposed to be able to splash out of them. Fairly dry around that. These cattle are actually gaining really well. Even this one with some genetic issues, he actually gained weight. But then we look at the toxic fescue just right next to those. They found a way to splash water out. These cattle were hanging out at this water trough. And in that environment, in April, when we weren't, getting above, 70 degrees during the day in northern Arkansas, these cattle were already under heat stress. They weren't grazing as long, and they were under considerable problems, and that contributes to a decrease in performance. So basically, we've all heard this. We're in fescue country here. It affects blood flow to the extremities. And that's why we lose feet and tails and ears. But it also impacts that heat tolerance, and it really increases hair growth. Glenn Aiken, a friend of mine, he did a lot of work in Kentucky, and he wanted to look at the skin temperature on cattle. So he sheared the cattle off in one specific spot, turned them out on tall fescue, and then he got the skin temperature from that shaved spot. And he wanted to use that same spot the next time. Cattle on non-toxic tall fescue, he still could find that same spot. And the cattle on toxic fescue, the hair grew back extremely fast. And so it's not just they're not losing the hair. They found that hair is growing back extremely rapidly. And like what we were talking about earlier with parasites, the biggest problem is not in those things that, you know, we can see easily with the hair growth and the heat tolerance. The biggest economic influence on this is those things we really can't see. Decreased performance because of decreased intake, that reduction in gain because they're not out grazing, and you know, huge changes in the breeding percentage on these cattle. When we look at our comparisons of toxic to non-toxic tall fescue, you know, that quality, the forage quality was the same. You know, essentially I showed you that graph. You know, our fall and winter is the time of lowest toxicity levels, but it's also the time when we shouldn't have a whole lot of heat stress on those cattle. And we still see a ½ pound per day reduction in average daily gain during the fall and winter. When we go into the spring, when we, you know, should have really good performance on these cattle because we've got a lot of forage, it's, you know, the grass is growing, it's getting ahead of them. But that's also the time of the highest toxin levels. We'll see a full pound reduction in gain performance. So, you know, if we look at, you know, the cow-calf industry, that most of the fescue belt is in cow-calf business. If we reduce weaning percentage and weaning weights, you know, we're looking at about 500 million, 600 million reduction in total costs just from those two factors. And that doesn't include those other things associated with tall fescue as far as decreased value of those cattle. When we look at that ½ pound decrease average daily gain in the fall and full pound decrease average daily in the spring, and a reduction in calf value, if we just look at $5 discount for rough hair coats and calves not shedding, that's a total reduction in value of about $140 per stocker calf. So, I also wanted to look at or mention the performance impacts isn't just on those cattle that we have on the fescue. It's a long-term problem, and there's 8 finishing experiments that I've found across, you know, different toxic tall fescue areas in Kentucky, over here at Parsons, Kansas, in eastern Oklahoma, in Missouri, Georgia, Mississippi, and Virginia, where they followed those cattle from grass all the way through slaughter. They compared non-toxic endophyte tall fescue to non-toxic tall fescue or alternative non-toxic forages like orchard grass or timothy or whatever it would be. So, you know, just an overview of where these cattle came from, like the cattle here in Virginia, they came out here to Lubbock area. The cattle here in Mississippi went to the same research feed yard there. These cattle in Georgia either went to Oklahoma State, where I'm currently at, or over here to West Texas A&M. We had some cattle in eastern Oklahoma that it wound up in the Oklahoma Panhandle. And then these cattle in Arkansas went to Oklahoma State University there at Stillwater as well. There's a large difference whenever we look at the type of operation. Oh yeah, and we had one here that went from Mississippi up into Iowa. But these finishing operations in the Texas and Oklahoma Panhandle are much different than the ones that we would see in the Midwest or in you know, the eastern United States, as far as those things we would look at like night cooling and wind relief from and low humidity as well. There's these 3 stars. The cattle that were here at Parsons on that grazing trial, they stayed there at that feed yard there. The one in Missouri stayed in Missouri, and this one in Kentucky was finished there. So what did we take back from that? We did see some compensatory gain on those cattle that were on tall fescue and went to finish, you know, on a non-toxic type feed. The average was about 50% compensation. So, if they were 100 pounds lighter leaving grass on a toxic plant, and they went through finishing and they were killed on the same number of days on feed, they were still 50 pounds lighter whenever those cattle were slaughtered. So they had higher average daily gain in most cases whenever they left the toxic fescue, but it didn't compensate fully for that reduction. Most of that compensatory gain occurred in the least stressful environments, whether it was feeding in the winter in the Midwest or leaving the humid area altogether and getting finished in the high plains. There was very little compensatory gain with summer finishing cattle in that humid environment. So, that toxin stays with those cattle and will follow them, and if they don't go to a spot where they have some relief from heat, they're going to have impacts. And that compensatory gain, for the most part, is a short-term prospect, and once those cattle reach full feed and reach their potential, they're going to quit having those higher gains. So whenever we start looking at tall fescue toxicosis and strategies to deal with it, we can either talk about replacing it. What was it, 30 years ago, Mark, they were talking about, or 35 years ago, endophyte-free tall fescue, which was a complete train wreck at least in Arkansas and eastern Oklahoma, because it didn't have those things that would make it easy to manage and keep it in a stand. The overgrazing protection. Complementary forages, we're looking at either interseeding some cool season annuals or most often we hear people recommend clovers. There's the pharmacological compounds that some of them work really, really well, some of them don't work all that well, and some of it works sometimes and doesn't work sometimes. But a lot of those have real good promise. Implants, medicated feed additives, and supplemental feeds. I'm going to give you a foretaste of what I'm going to say next, but for most of these things, if we're looking at comparing that to a non-toxic plant, whether it's wheat pasture, non-toxic tall fescue, or other types of cool season forages, we'll still get the same bump in performance using those strategies on that as we would with the toxic tall fescue. All of these things are additive, so if we replace the toxic tall fescue, we're still going to see that benefit from the complementary forages, the implants, the Rumensin or Bovatec, and the supplemental feed as well, and the pharmacological compounds. So the two forage-based strategies that I've done work with when I was at Arkansas is looking at replacement of that toxic tall fescue, or looking at clover addition. Let's look at diluting that out. Whenever we look at replacing, we had a toxic tall fescue. We planted a non-toxic tall fescue. In this case, it was Max Q. And then we compared that to just looking at a small grain that we planted every year, rye and ryegrass in this case. In the fall, like I'd said earlier, we got right at a little bit over a pound, nearly a pound, 1.4 pounds of gain per day on the toxic tall fescue. With the non-toxic tall fescue, we got right at 1.9 pounds a day. During the spring, we got less than a pound a day of gain with those calves, and right at 1.9 pounds a day with the non-toxic tall fescue. Whenever we looked at comparing that to a small grain that we had to plant every year, we got a 0.7 of a pound bump, a little bit higher gains with the small grains compared to the non-toxic tall fescue in the fall and the spring as well, 1.3 pound increase in gain on those cool season annuals. When we did an economic analysis on this. Compared to that small grain that we have to plant every year, even getting a little bit less gain with a non-toxic tall fescue, we're averaging about 1.9 pounds of gain a day going all the way from the fall into the spring. It only took about 3 years to pay back our replacement cost compared to that small grain, because we don't have to plant it every year. I've got another slide to show the benefit looking at replacing a toxic here in a second. So why do we look at clovers? You know, clovers have, you know, some great benefits to us. They fix nitrogen, they reduce our fertilizer costs, but it's not a free, you know, nitrogen like a lot of us think. You know, there are some costs involved. We have to have some grazing management to keep them in a stand. We need to keep our phosphorus and potassium and our pH of our soil right to effectively utilize them and keep them in our pastures. They can increase forage quality, result in some increased animal performance, and, you know, on this case, dilute some tall fescue toxins, and they help extend our grazing season. And we have some slides here in a second. But here's the spring average daily gain, whether we use nitrogen fertilizer, which was about 100 pounds of nitrogen per year, that's what this N over here is, or clovers. Whenever we look at adding clovers to a well-fertilized toxic tall fescue stand, we increase gain from that 0.9 pounds per day up to about 1.3 pounds per day. So we got about a 0.4 pound increase in average daily gain when we added a white clover to that stand. When we looked at our non-toxic tall fescue, in this case it was Max Q and Max Q2, two Pennington seed releases, you know, we got right over 2 pounds a day when we fertilized, and right at 0.3 pounds added when we used clovers in the spring. So whether we looked at a toxic tall fescue or a non-toxic tall fescue, we got that same bump in performance through using clovers. So I don't know if that tells us we're not really diluting that toxin, but we're getting the same benefit from an increased forage quality in those animals from that clover. Gain per acre, we did see more gain per acre when we fertilized that compared to the clovers, but we still saw that same increase compared to you know, the toxic versus the non-toxic. Cost per acre, whenever we, you know, plant something every other year, especially with that white clover, and a lot of times we don't have to do it every year, even using some, you know, fairly high priced seed, which is, you know, using a selected variety is always better than not. We're decreasing our cost, and we also decreased our cost per pound of gain as well. Our net return per acre with this, we actually had a net loss in return on the toxic tall fescue without clover. It's a horrible stocker cattle forage. You know, if we're looking at only, you know, 1 to 1.3 pounds per day in the fall, whenever those cattle should be gaining 2, looking at less than a pound a day in the spring, you know, it's not something I would, you know, really want to rely on to graze. We saw about $100 an acre increase whenever we went to using the clovers, but we're still just barely above a break even with that. When we looked at the non-toxic, we still saw an increase in net return per acre when we go from nitrogen fertilizer up to using clovers with those novel endophyte or non-toxic endophyte fescues. We saw, whether we used nitrogen fertilizer or not, a $165 increase in net return per acre when we went with a non-toxic tall fescue. And that included a, spread out about a 5-year cost on that replacement cost. Replacing a toxic tall fescue with a non-toxic tall fescue. So Mark, what does it cost now is the estimate to replace toxic fescue with non-toxic tall fescue?
So about $200.
So I've been throwing out that $200 an acre number for a long time, and I'm glad to hear somebody else say that. So, and that sounds really high, but if you're making $165 an acre more a year, how long does it take you to get that back? It's about 1.2 years. So in the second year, you've covered the cost of this permanent pasture replacement, compared to a toxic tall fescue. There's actually some producers I've talked to back east that are, starting to replace toxic tall fescue with non-toxic endophyte infected tall fescue in rented land if they can get a long-term lease. It's that much more valuable to them. And you can see, profit per steer and profit per acre are related to this. You're making a lot more money on that. So the return on investment is really good. So I said a little bit about the additive nature of all these things that we can use to replace the fescue toxins. And, Craig Roberts and John Andre, had a presentation and wrote this up. If we look at the grass only, where performance would be right here with toxic, if we use summer pasture during the summer, we can make up some of that. We can replace some of that with legumes, and make up some of that with a feed supplement. And, implants, ionophores, any of those technologies that we would use are additive in nature. They have different modes of action. So eventually you start stacking those on, we should be able to get the same performance, with toxic fescue as you would with a non-toxic fescue. So Shane Gadberry and I at Arkansas, we put together this research, and this is a pretty busy slide, and the only reason I have it here, I know most of you can't read it, but I need to be able to see it because I wanted to remember what it said. But they had one treatment that was just a free choice non-medicated mineral on non-toxic fescue and toxic fescue with a range of levels of toxicity. They had 8 other pastures where they provided the cattle in there a mineral supplement fortified with rumensin on it to get that ionophore response. We implanted those cattle to get extra growth promoting hormone in those cattle. And then we fed 1% of body weight of a byproduct feed every day. And then we adjusted that so that we kept that same supplement rate. We wanted to stack all of these technologies and see if that's the case. Can we add all these things together and still get the same benefit as we would? So we did it twice, once in the fall from October up to March, or October up to January, and then once in the spring from March into June. That March into June, that's getting into some heat. It's getting into our high toxicity levels on that. And here's what we saw in the spring. We had this point here where we've got fairly low toxicity with a control treatment. Those cattle were gaining about 1.7 pounds a day. Here's another point with low toxicity where they got all those, and we're looking at about 2.4 pounds of gain a day. So that's really kind of the response we would expect from we've got a fairly high quality supplement or high quality grass. We're going to see an ionophore response. We're going to see an implant response, and we'll see some supplement response. Here's the toxicity level. As we increase toxicity across the bottom, we went from fairly non-toxic to pretty darn toxic on that. And the red line here, that's the performance that we saw with those cattle going from, really, that's a regression line, but, the average response as we go from fairly non-toxic all the way up to really, really toxic. These cattle on this 3,000 parts per billion ergovaline, really didn't gain a whole lot of weight. It was very close to zero. When we added that supplementation and the ionophore and that implant, we did see, as we increased the toxicity on those cattle, we did see a slight decrease in performance, but it was essentially a flat line. So, at low toxicity, we're making up about 0.8 of a pound of gain a day. Here at fairly high toxicity, we're making up about 2 pounds of gain a day. So there's some expenses with this. If you were going to completely replace it, you're still with supplementation. You're not getting as good a performance on toxic tall fescue as you would with a non-toxic, and you're still getting a supplement response to those technologies. But we can do a lot of good replacing those by using those additive technologies with that. Is there any questions on that tall fescue? Yes, sir.
When you're talking $200 an acre, are you talking the seed cost, or are you talking tillage,
So,
everything, just overall all of it together, seed included kind of deal?
yeah, whenever I did that, we in Arkansas, we replaced, some toxic. We replaced, planted novel endophyte in, wheat fields and that kind of thing. We included all the tillage, or if we're no tilling, all the spray operations, the seed for the cover crops. Then we added back the value of any hay or grazing that we got from those cover crops. And then, right or wrong, I always included about a year where you don't use those tall fescue stands. So there's an opportunity cost there that I'm not sold that's 100% true, because in a lot of our seedings that we've done, especially with these newer varieties, the Estancia, MaxQ2, those types of varieties, we weren't able to graze that fall, but we did get substantial grazing in the spring if conditions are right. So, that opportunity cost of laying it out for a whole year before you can graze that may or may not work into it. So I feel pretty comfortable with that $200 an acre being a true economic cost. If you talk to producers, they just count the cost of the seed and maybe a drill rental. That, makes it sound awful cheap.
Did you use weed any for a cover crop in with them, or mulch crop with them, and plant it with the fescue, or did you?
No, I never planted anything but, our target crop with that. And, in southern Arkansas, we had a lot of trouble with ryegrass. And some of those, in good growing conditions, these newer varieties of non-toxic endophyte, they'll come up out of the ground so fast you're afraid you got a annual ryegrass competing with it. But I mean, man, that stuff has been really impressive. Any other questions on it? Yes, sir.
Have you ever used any biologicals or humic acid or anything like that to kind of control your toxicity?
So I've not used the humic acid. I was involved with some studies where we look back at a lot of literature, and that's one of them that there's not a lot of literature on, but some of it that we found either showed it was pretty promising or there was no response. So that's one I'm really not, I can't give you a good solid answer on that. I just have to see more research to know what it's doing and really see when it does work best and what conditions don't. It's a lot of these things, we're looking at biological processes and not everything works all the time. So, we've got lots of data on everything we do, implants, ionophores, and all that where it works sometimes, and every once in a while it just doesn't. So, the jury's still out for me on that one. We did try some different biomass type products, the yeast cell walls that capture some of the endophyte toxins, and there is some benefit to those as well. None of those seem to completely make up for that toxin, especially in these real high toxin loads.
Do you see where you're putting on nitrogen, do you see your toxicity raise?
Yes, we do. Especially that one with the clover trial, those cattle were hurting pretty bad. That was the trial. We had a field day. The field day for that station is always about the 21st of April. It's not a real hot time of the year in northern Arkansas. Go out the morning of the field day, look at the cattle, make sure everything's where it should be, and there's one laying dead from heat stress, the morning of. So those cattle were hammered pretty hard with the endophyte load on that one.
We had an extreme amount of rain this last year, and I know I've seen the cows standing under the trees and standing in water holes and in places that not normally they're doing that. Did the increased rainfall make it worse?
So I think in talking to the plant physiologists, anything that stresses those plants will increase the toxin load or increase the endophyte load. Yeah. So with increased toxin load, increased toxicity, you're going to get more on the cattle as well. Yes, sir.
What sort of systems, he was talking about using the nursery crop, so expand on that, what sort of systems have you seen that works with replacement, basically to keep the old toxic endophyte out and to replace it with the new?
So, I don't plant anything with the non-toxic, what I'm planting, but when we go to replace a toxic tall fescue stand, I generally will start the spring before I want to do it, before it goes to seed, and spray it with a fairly significant rate of Roundup. Plant a warm season annual, a Sudan grass or a millet or something as either a grazing or a hay crop. On those I usually prefer cutting it for hay. Then, especially if I'm doing like a research trial where I want it really clean, we'll go in and spray it again, plant a wheat crop in there. So we kind of spray, smother, spray is what they always called that. But we go ahead and take it out of tall fescue for a full year. Get a cool season annual planted, a rye, wheat, something like that. We can graze that through the winter, spray it again in the spring, do another cover crop in the summer, and then plant the new fescue that next fall. So it's essentially out of tall fescue for a year and a half, year and a few months, but we're getting some benefit out of those cool season annuals and the warm season annuals we're planting. we've had really good luck doing that. We don't have any escapes, so we're real confident with that. If a person doesn't want to invest that much time, you can spray it early, plant a smother crop in the summer, and then spray it again before you plant your new endophyte fescue, and you won't have that many escapes as well. But we've had good luck with that as well. I think if you're wanting to get a permanent stand, something you can manage for a long period of time and know it's not toxic, then probably the most care you can do would help. This particular tall fescue here, it was one of those where we tried doing the shortcut where we sprayed in August and then came back 6 weeks later and sprayed again. And this side of the graph from about 1500 on, that's a toxic fescue identified to keep toxic. These here from about 0 to up to about 1500 parts per billion, those were pastures that we had sprayed once and then 6 weeks later sprayed again and then planted our novel endophyte fescue. And all of these toxic plants in here were escapes from that system. So, you can take some shortcuts and take care of a lot of your toxic fescue, but there are escapes that happen. And we just weren't really happy with what happened here, but it did give us a good way to do some research looking at a range of toxic tall fescue in that. I got 5 minutes to talk about bermudagrass. I got one more question.
Do you know specifically what causes the rapid hair growth?
No, I don't. Glenn Aiken, who's now at University of Florida, he was in Kentucky when he did that. He could probably tell us. So bermudagrass, very high yield potential, highly responsive to management, limited animal performance. We've had cattle out on bermudagrass in Arkansas for most of this, where we got cattle to gain right at a pound per day up to nearly 2 pounds per day, and a lot of that depends on the management, quality of the grass. The further north we go, the higher quality that bermudagrass can stay through the summer. So in this part of Kansas, if we have some bermudagrass, probably could expect higher performance than we would see in southern Arkansas. It's higher in crude protein and low digestibility. It's not the same as what you would see from a tallgrass prairie type plant. It's actually the opposite. It's lower in crude protein and quite often higher in digestibility than bermudagrass. So the supplementation of that really doesn't fit the same model. Here's a trial where we looked at using distillers grains, dried distillers grains as a supplement. Cattle weighed about 575 whenever they went out on this. Without supplementation, these cattle did fairly well, up at about 1.8 pounds per day. When we had 2 pounds of distillers grains per day, we got about 0.4 of a pound added gain with that. Fairly good response. Feed to gain ratio or supplement to gain of about 4.5 pounds. When we look at going up a level to 4 pounds per day, we only got an extra 0.2 of a pound. Lower feed to gain, but when we're feeding that 4 pounds a day, we can actually increase our carrying capacity slightly. And that was part of this study when we looked at 2 different stocking rates. If we had a higher stocking rate and fed that higher amount, we did see some benefit as far as total gain per acre. Here's some research we did last summer. We wanted to look at, not supplementing just supplementing in the late season, either with a block type supplement or a corn gluten feed byproduct, versus all summer with a block or a corn gluten feed. Saw fairly good response, especially with that corn gluten feed during the early summer. Slightly better response, or just a slight response with the low consumption block that we had. If we're looking at energy replacement, you know, adding energy to that is going to be important. Supplement efficiency, if we're just looking at that block season, got fairly efficient response to that block just with that late season supplementation. When we're feeding all summer, you know, we're seeing a response to that supplement by adding that mid-protein type supplement to that bermudagrass. And so supplementation is important when we're looking at these warm season perennials, the introduced ones, but I wanted to mention a little bit about some work I did with bermudagrass with clover. We were using white clover and a red clover along with looking at an alfalfa. And when we look at performance over the 4 years on this, we saw an improved gain whenever we added supplementation. Average daily gain, or not supplementation, supplemental nitrogen. Average daily gain increased as we put more fertilizer out on that. Total gain per acre increased. Whenever we looked at adding clovers or alfalfa, we didn't see as big an increase in average daily gain as we saw with fertilizer, but we were able to start grazing about a month earlier. So we extended our grazing season, put more gain on those animals, so our total gain per acre was quite a bit better. Here's the gain response curves we saw with either 50 or 100 units of nitrogen. So we saw an increase in gain per acre with 50 units of nitrogen, even higher with 100 units of nitrogen. But when we compared that to our clovers, you know, instead of 360 pounds of gain per acre with clover or alfalfa, we saw about 500 pounds of total gain per acre. So, you know, because we extended that grazing season, we got a really nice response. During a drought year, we still saw a really nice response to fertilizer. Our pounds of gain per pound of added fertilizer were about 1 to 1.5 pounds of added gain per pound of fertilizer. So it still pays to fertilize with nitrogen on these Bermuda grasses. So with these tame grasses, you know, compared to a native grass, they offer as many problems as solutions. They're highly productive. They're hard to overgraze, but they do require management, and they do respond to supplementation. Clovers do offer benefits when we're looking at incorporating those into these stands. So with that, I appreciate the invitation and answer any more questions you might have. Yes, ma'am.
Say you go through all this work and you replant with the non-toxic, but your neighbor still has toxic. Do you have cross-pollination concerns? Will it eventually evolve back
So
to toxic?
the toxin, the endophyte, travels in the seed. So there's not like you can get pollination from, you know, your neighbor's plant into yours. But if you have a pasture that's toxic tall fescue and you mow it and get seed on it and move over and mow your non-toxic tall fescue stand, you could move seed into you can contaminate it. Cattle can carry it. It takes about 3 days to pass, you know, completely turn over the rumen contents. Some seed does make it through the GI tract. So you rotate cows from a toxic onto a non-toxic, they can contaminate your pastures. Birds can carry it in. So, you know, there's some things you can do as far as, you know, being careful when you move equipment from toxic to non-toxic, having cows not move directly from where they're grazing seed in a toxic onto a non-toxic. But probably the best thing to do is just make sure your non-toxic stand is robust by not overgrazing it, you know, not having a whole lot of open spots for new seedlings to come up. Because, you know, the intake thing is important. The reason why toxic endophyte tall fescue is so robust is because cattle don't graze it as hard. The intake is lower. So you can stock higher. If you manage a non-toxic field the same way, they will, you know, graze it. They actually like it more, so they'll eat more of it, eat deeper down into the crown, and you can weaken your stand. So, you know, there are some concerns. You just got to manage it to keep a strong, robust stand, and you won't have the problem with new seed coming in and reseeding it to toxic.
Do you have any comparison where you put clover in your fescue versus the new improved fescues?
Yes, sir.
How much difference is there?
So what we saw is with a toxic and we add clover, we get about 3 or 4 tenths of a pound added gain. If we put clover in with the non-toxic, we're still going to see a 3 or 4 tenths pound added gain. So we're getting the benefit both of the clover and the decreased toxicity, and it's just additive on top of each other.
Well,
Yes,
if you had the old toxic, and you kind of a shortcut to it, add the legumes, why you'd be somewhat close to tearing up and putting in your improved fescue.
No, I think the way my economics turned out when I did that comparison, we still saw about $165 an acre increased net return with the non-toxic tall fescue with the added clover, just because you're still getting that clover response on top of the decreased toxicity response.
So if you're looking at conversion rates on like bermudagrass and fescue with the byproduct supplement like corn gluten, how would you, was that kind of season long? If they were, it looked like it was about 5 or 6 to 1. Would you expect that through the whole season, or?
So we probably got the best response on those byproducts when we fed season long, especially on bermudagrass. I haven't done a lot of supplementation work on the non-toxic tall fescue, but we did see a supplement response to that as well. It's just hard to tease out how much of that was the ionophore, how much of it was the implant.
You think that was due to protein or energy?
On both of those cases, it was energy.
And so you think that you could kind of assume a 5 to 6 to 1 conversion on that?
Yeah, so even with wheat pasture, tall fescue, early bermudagrass, if we're carrying, especially if we're carrying an ionophore, we'll see about 4 to 5.5 pounds of supplement per pound of gain, which, you know, that's kind of getting to the level. It's not a no-brainer like if we're putting a pound of cottonseed cake out to some steers on tallgrass prairie in the late summer, you know, we get, 1.5 to 2 pounds of supplement per pound added gain. We're going to do that no matter what. Whenever we, look at that 4 to 5 pounds of supplement, it depends on how much the supplement costs and, what the value of gain is on those steers. And usually it's going to be profitable, but not in every case. Yes, sir.
Any research on blending clover and Bermuda and broadcasting that into infected fescue to extend grazing even more, or have some diversified grasses out there?
So the fescue stands I dealt with most, it was really hard to keep contamination of the warm season plants out of them. Especially in southern Arkansas. Northern Arkansas, it was a little bit easier to keep a pure stand of fescue. So I couldn't really tell you how good a stand of Bermuda grass you would get just by spreading some seed out. I would think, if you could do something to, open up your fescue stand a little bit and get the Bermuda grass down to the soil, you'd probably have better luck of getting that in. And it may be something like a crabgrass, an annual to dilute that stand of toxic fescue may work better.